asked to speak about inclusive economies for women's empowerment. As you've heard, I'm a feminist economist. What I want to do is unpack a little bit, what does this mean, inclusive economies for women's empowerment? I will conclude by saying something about the challenges of the COVID pandemic for inclusive economies and women's empowerment. So, economic inclusion and women's empowerment, they both sound very positive things, and they're themes of the Sustainable Development Agenda, although there's no goal or target that specifically brings them together. The ones that speak about sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth don't actually mention women's empowerment, and SDG 5, which requires governments to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, doesn't actually mention economic inclusion, although it does very importantly call on governments to undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources. And I think we need to focus more on the issue of rights, not just participation, to ensure that economic inclusion really does empower women. So first I want to clarify a little bit, what do we mean by inclusion? Inclusion sounds very positive, but when you look at the reality, there are many forms of inclusion in economies that can be harmful. Let me just list some of them. Forcible inclusion, forced labor and modern slavery. Injurious inclusion, unsafe working conditions, long and exhausting hours of work. Impoverished inclusion, where earnings are not above the poverty level. Precarious inclusion, where employment is insecure. Segregated inclusion, inclusion in low-paying occupations at the bottom of the jobs hierarchy. Now, those are not the things that people have in mind when they talk about how inclusion in the economy will empower women. But those are many of the realities that many women face. So we have to be very careful what kind of inclusion we're talking about. Similarly, inclusion in financial markets. This sounds very good. Every woman should have a bank account. But when you start to engage with financial markets, you can face harms. You can face predators who missell financial products, who defraud you, who increase your levels of indebtedness, lead to loss of assets and to vulnerability of harassment by debt collectors. So again, financial inclusion needs unpacking. There are forms of financial inclusion that are beneficial, but there are also forms that are harmful. And one of the problems that many women face, I think, is that they're simultaneously included and excluded. This is an idea that UNCTAD, in its Trade and Development Report in 2017, put forward. Women are included in the sense that they're participating in the labour market and in financial markets, but they're often excluded from the prosperity that is supposed to come from this inclusion. And if you look at the global data sets put together by the ILO, you'll see that women predominate among workers in vulnerable employment, defined as own account workers and contributing family workers. And ILO data on a broader range of so-called non-standard forms of employment, temporary employment, seasonal work, casual work, part-time, on-call employment, agency work, etc., show that women and young people and migrants are more likely to be found in non-standard arrangements compared to men. So I think we do face a challenge of how can inclusion be made empowering. It's not enough to celebrate that more women are participating in the labour market. It's not enough to celebrate that more women are participating in financial markets. We have to focus on the issue of how can this inclusion be made empowering. Well, the ILO put forward some ideas in its 1999 Decent Work Agenda, drawing attention to 4 issues. The first is the creation of full and productive employment that can provide a decent livelihood. The second was rights at work. The third is social protection, including cash benefits and access to basic services. And the fourth is promotion of social dialogue between government, employers, subcontractors, and workers' organizations. And gender equality is a cross-cutting objective of the decent work agenda. And it's important that this agenda recognizes that empowerment does not come from employment alone, but also needs access to social protection, to cash benefits, and access to basic services. And this becomes very apparent when we look at the impact of COVID-19. Let me say something as well about the interaction between participation in the economy and the unpaid work that most women around the world have to do, and some women are really burdened with. So inclusion in paid work will not be empowering if it adds to paid work to already long hours of unpaid work. Many low-income women are overworked. They're already participating in work that generates some income, although not enough, but also burdened with the need to collect fuel and water, prepare meals, take care of children, frail elderly people, people living with long-term illness. Their long hours of exhausting work, both paid and unpaid, deplete their own health and strength. So too much work is far from empowering. So for these women, empowerment must include a reduction of their overall work burden and more time for rest and for participation in the life of the community through, for instance, the political processes that we were hearing about. Empowerment isn't just a matter of having an income. It's also having some free time, perhaps free time to participate in sport in the way that Donna talked about. And investment is needed to provide affordable access to clean energy, water, sanitation, and care. Now, the SDGs, I think, do recognize this, but sometimes when we talk about women's economic empowerment, we only talk about the labor market and the financial market, and we forget the need for this complementary investment in energy, water, sanitation, and care services. Let me finally turn to the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we've seen everywhere around the world that women play a disproportionate role in responding to the virus because they are the majority of frontline healthcare workers, and they also undertake the majority of care in the home. Women's unpaid care work has increased significantly as a result of school closures and the increased needs of older people. Women have also been harder hit by the economic impact of measures to halt the spread of COVID-19, especially women who work in the informal economy. Globally, nearly 60% of women work in the informal economy, both as self-employed workers and as waged workers. And this goes up to 90% in developing countries. So if we're really talking about the empowerment of women through inclusion in the economy, we really have to focus on the informal economy. And now governments aiming to slow the virus have put in place measures ranging from border closures to full lockdown. And many of these measures have forced informal workers to give up their livelihoods, alter their ways of working, and their incomes have been reduced. Sometimes it's been made impossible for informal workers to earn a livelihood, and their very survival of these workers and their families have been threatened. So government should issue clear directives to lockdown enforcement agents to refrain from harassment, violence, bribery, forced evictions, and demolition of informal workers' assets, including their homes and their workplaces. We are seeing through the misuse of public health measures to contain COVID-19, the destruction of inclusion and empowerment for large numbers of women in the informal economy, and this has to stop. However, many governments are expanding and adapting social protection measures in an attempt to provide at least a basic level of food and income security to the many households that rely on earnings from informal work. In April, the World Bank identified 133 countries which had implemented such measures, but a large number of these are short-term emergency measures. So my final point is looking to the longer term. There's new research from a wonderful organization called Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, UNGA, which suggests that the impact of COVID-19 on informal incomes is unlikely to be short-term. While the safety nets currently being put in place are vital in this time of immediate crisis, when they come to an end, informal workers need access to recovery packages, including low-interest loans, access to startup capital, access to public procurement processes which allow for informal workers' participation, and reskilling and training programs. Women's empowerment requires much more than participation in the labour market and the financial market. It requires participation that is accompanied by measures to realise women's economic and social rights. And I think we need a renewed emphasis on this if we're going to come back from COVID-19 and move back on track for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.